Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history, where we explore the uncomfortable truths about how our ancestors really lived. Tonight, we're taking a journey back over 2,000 years to ancient Greece, but this isn't going to be your typical glamorous Hollywood version of Greek civilization. We're going to talk about the reality of daily life in ancient Athens, Sparta, and the countless smaller city-states that dotted the Mediterranean landscape. We're going to discuss why, despite all our romantic notions about classical antiquity, most of us modern folks would probably last about a week before begging to come back to our climate-controlled, smartphone-enabled 21st century existence before you settle in. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you're into this kind of deep dive content. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You wake up, not to the gentle buzz of your smartphone alarm, but to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant bleating of goats. There's no snooze button, no quick scroll through social media while you gather the mental energy to face the day. Instead, you're immediately confronted with the harsh reality that if you don't get up and start working, you and your family might not eat today. This is the first shock that would hit most modern people transported back to ancient Greece, the immediate, pressing nature of survival that governed every single day. The concept of leisure as we know it simply didn't exist for the vast majority of the population. While we often think of ancient Greeks lounging around discussing philosophy and democracy, that lifestyle was reserved for a tiny elite class of male citizens who owned slaves to do their actual work. For everyone else we're talking about, roughly 90% of the population life was an endless cycle of back-breaking labor, just to maintain the most basic standard of living. Think about your typical weekend. You might sleep in, grab coffee from your favorite cafe, binge watch a series on streaming platforms, meet friends for brunch, go shopping at a mall with hundreds of stores, or simply relax at home with air conditioning and unlimited entertainment options. Now, imagine that none of these activities existed, and more importantly, that you couldn't afford to take time away from essential survival tasks, even if they did. Every single day was Monday in ancient Greece, with no concept of weekends, vacation days, or personal time off. Let's start with something as simple as getting dressed in the morning. You reach for your clothes, except there's no closet full of options, no drawers stuffed with clean underwear and socks. If you're lucky enough to own more than one kitten, the basic Greek garment that resembled a long shirt, it's probably made of rough, scratchy wool that would make modern synthetic fabrics feel like silk by comparison. The wealthy might have linen, which was softer but incredibly expensive. Cotton didn't exist in Greece yet, and silk was so rare and costly that only the absolute elite could afford it. These garments weren't just uncomfortable by our standards, they were also incredibly difficult to keep clean. There were no washing machines, no detergent, no fabric softener. Cleaning clothes involved hauling them down to the nearest river or public fountain, where you'd spend hours scrubbing them against rocks with harsh soap made from animal fat and ash. The process was so labor-intensive that most people only washed their clothes when they became absolutely unbearable to wear. Imagine the physical toll this took on people's bodies. Women would spend entire days bent over riverbanks, their hands raw and bleeding from the coarse soap and rough stones. The repetitive scrubbing motion caused chronic back pain and joint problems that would plague them for life. In winter, this meant breaking ice to reach running water and scrubbing clothes in freezing temperatures until your hands were numb and your body was shaking uncontrollably. The soap itself was made from wood, ash, and animal fat. Imagine washing your delicate modern fabrics with what was essentially lye. It would eat through the fibers, fade any colors, and leave everything stiff and scratchy against your skin. And speaking of cleanliness, let's talk about personal hygiene, because this is where most modern people would really struggle. The ancient Greeks did value cleanliness more than many other ancient civilizations, but their standards were still worlds apart from ours. A daily shower was unthinkable for most people. Water had to be carried by hand from wells or streams, heated over fires, and used sparingly. Most people might bathe once a week if they were fortunate, and even then, it was often in cold water with soap that would strip the natural oils from your skin, leaving it dry and cracked. Dental hygiene was particularly challenging. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss. People might clean their teeth with frayed twigs or rough cloth, sometimes using mixtures of crushed oyster shells or pumice stone as an abrasive. Imagine the sensation of scrubbing your teeth with what was essentially sandpaper. Most adults had significant tooth decay, missing teeth, and chronic gum disease. The smell of a typical ancient Greek's breath would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. The psychological impact of poor dental health extended far beyond physical discomfort. Chronic tooth pain was a constant companion for most people, affecting their ability to eat, sleep, and concentrate. Imagine trying to focus on daily tasks while dealing with the kind of throbbing toothache that would send modern people rushing to the emergency dentist. There was no pain relief available, no aspirin, no numbing agents, no professional dental care. People simply had to endure excruciating pain until the tooth fell out or the infection killed them. Many people died from dental abscesses that spread to their bloodstream, causing sepsis that could have been easily prevented with modern antibiotics and dental care. Now, let's talk about food, because this is where the reality of ancient life becomes truly stark. Forget about your morning coffee. Coffee beans weren't available in Greece. There was no tea either, unless you count various herbal concoctions that were more medicine than beverage. Most people started their day with watered-down wine, which was safer to drink than water in many areas due to contamination issues. This wine was nothing like modern wine. It was often sour, rough, and mixed with various additives, including seawater, tree resin, and herbs. Breakfast, if you had it at all, might consist of bread dipped in olive oil, perhaps with some honey if you were fortunate. But this bread wasn't the soft, fluffy loaves we're accustomed to. It was dense, often gritty with sand and bits of stone from the grinding process, and frequently moldy or infested with insects. The flour was coarsely ground, and bakers had no way to remove all the foreign matter that found its way into the grain during harvesting and storage. For the majority of the population, meat was a rare luxury reserved for religious festivals and special occasions. Your protein came mainly from fish if you lived near the coast, or from legumes like lentils and chickpeas if you lived inland. These legumes were often the primary source of sustenance for the poor, cooked into thick porridges that would be eaten day after day with little variation. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally and preserved without refrigeration: onions, garlic, cabbage, and various greens that would be pickled or dried for the winter months. The monotony of this diet would drive most modern people to despair within weeks. Imagine eating the same lentil porridge for breakfast, lunch, and dinner day after day, month after month. There were no spices imported from distant lands to add variety, just local herbs like oregano, thyme, and mint that grew wild. Salt was precious and expensive, so most food was under-seasoned by modern standards. Sugar didn't exist. Honey was the only sweetener, and it was so valuable that it was often used as currency. The concept of treating yourself to something delicious, of having comfort food when you're sad, or of enjoying a meal for pure pleasure was completely foreign. To most people's experience, fresh fruits were seasonal luxuries that disappeared for months at a time. Apples, pears, and grapes were available only during specific harvest periods and had to be dried or preserved if you wanted to enjoy them. Later, citrus fruits weren't available in Greece at all. The vitamins and nutrients that we get from fresh produce year-round were simply unavailable for large portions of the year, leading to nutritional deficiencies that affected everything from wound healing to mental health. The lack of refrigeration meant that food spoilage was a constant concern. Meat had to be consumed immediately after slaughter or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying processes that made it tough, overly salty, and often barely palatable. Milk couldn't be stored fresh, so it was quickly turned into cheese, which was often hard, salty, and pungent. Fish were preserved in salt or fish sauce, creating intensely flavored condiments that would overwhelm most modern palates. Food safety was a constant gamble. There were no health inspectors, no regulations, no understanding of bacteria or foodborne illness. People regularly fell sick from contaminated food and water, and many of these illnesses were fatal. Diarrhea, vomiting, and stomach cramps were common experiences that people simply had to endure without the benefit of modern medicine. Speaking of medicine, let's delve into what happened when you got sick, because this is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of ancient life for modern people to contemplate. The ancient Greeks did have physicians, and some of their medical knowledge was surprisingly advanced. But their treatments were often as dangerous as the diseases they were trying to cure. If you developed a fever, you might be prescribed bloodletting, pints of blood drained from your body based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia or sterilization. Imagine having a tooth pulled or a broken bone set while fully conscious, biting down on a leather strap while the physician worked with crude bronze or iron instruments. The surgical procedures themselves were nightmarish by modern standards. Amputations were performed with saws and knives that were used for multiple patients without any cleaning between uses. Patients were held down by multiple people while they screamed in agony. Many people died from shock during these procedures, while others succumbed to infections that developed afterward. The lucky ones passed out from pain, but many remained conscious throughout entire operations. Battlefield medicine was particularly brutal. Soldiers wounded in combat might have arrows removed by simply pushing them through their bodies, causing additional tissue damage and bleeding. Broken bones were set by feel, often healing improperly and leaving people permanently disabled. Burns from Greek fire or other incendiary weapons were treated with animal fat and honey, which often trapped bacteria and made infections worse rather than better. Infections were treated with various poultices and herbal remedies, some of which were helpful, but many of which were either useless or actively harmful. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death from sepsis. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mother and child, with mortality rates that would be shocking. By modern standards, women regularly died from complications that would be easily treatable today. Mental illness was poorly understood, and often attributed to possession by evil spirits or punishment from the gods. Treatment might involve exorcism rituals, confinement, or being chained up like an animal. There was no concept of therapy, antidepressants, or psychiatric care. People suffering from what we now know as depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions were left to struggle alone or were ostracized from society. Let's talk about housing, because the homes of ancient Greeks would shock most modern people with their primitive conditions. Unless you were among the wealthy elite, you lived in a small, dark, poorly ventilated structure made of sun-dried mud bricks. These homes had no windows in the modern sense, just small openings that might be covered with wooden shutters or cloth. There was no glass, so you had to choose between having light and protecting yourself from the elements. The floors were typically just packed earth, sometimes covered with stone slabs if you were prosperous. There was no central heating, no air conditioning, no plumbing. In winter, you stayed warm by burning charcoal or wood in small braziers, filling your home with smoke and creating a constant risk of fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. Many people suffered from chronic respiratory problems due to the poor indoor air quality. The danger of fire was ever present and terrifying. Homes were built close together with shared walls, and most construction materials were highly flammable. A single overturned oil lamp or an errant spark from a cooking fire could ignite an entire neighborhood within minutes. There were no fire departments, no organized firefighting efforts, and no fire-resistant building materials. When fires started, people grabbed what they could carry and ran, often losing everything they owned in a matter of hours. The smoke from cooking fires and heating braziers created a constant haze inside homes that would be unbearable to modern people accustomed to clean indoor air. Eyes burned and watered continuously, throats were always scratchy and sore, and the constant inhalation of particulates led to chronic coughs and breathing difficulties. Children raised in these environments often developed respiratory problems that plagued them throughout their shortened lives. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Entire families lived in one or two rooms, with multiple generations sharing the same cramped space. There were no separate bedrooms for children, no private bathrooms, no quiet spaces to retreat to when you needed solitude. Everything you did was observed by your family members, and everything they did was visible to you. The lack of artificial lighting meant that your daily schedule was entirely dependent on the sun. When darkness fell, you had only oil lamps or candles for illumination, and these were expensive and dangerous. Most people simply went to bed when the sun set and rose when it came up. There was no staying up late to read, watch entertainment, or socialize. The winter months, with their long nights, were periods of enforced inactivity and boredom that would drive most modern people to despair. Sanitation was primitive and often horrifying by today's standards. There were no flush toilets, no sewage systems in most areas. Waste was disposed of in chamber pots that had to be emptied into streets or designated areas outside the city. The smell in urban areas was overwhelming, with human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and industrial byproducts creating a miasma of odors that would make most modern visitors immediately nauseous. Public latrines, where they existed, were communal affairs with no privacy partitions. Multiple people would sit side by side on benches with holes, conducting their business while carrying on conversations. The concept of toilet paper didn't exist. People used stones, pottery shards, or pieces of cloth that were reused repeatedly. The The social aspect of using public latrines created a completely different relationship with bodily functions and privacy than modern people could tolerate. Important. Business deals were conducted, political discussions held, and social relationships maintained while people relieved themselves in full view of others. The smell was overwhelming. Imagine the worst public restroom you've ever encountered, then multiply that by 100. There was no running water to flush away waste, no disinfectant to kill germs, no ventilation to clear the air. The reusable cleaning materials were a constant source of disease transmission. Families would wash and reuse the same pieces of cloth for months, spreading intestinal parasites and bacterial infections among household members. Wealthy people might have access to softer materials like wool or linen scraps, while the poor made do with whatever rough materials they could find. Some people used leaves, but only certain types were suitable, and they weren't always available. Privacy for bodily functions was such a foreign concept that there wasn't even a word for it in most Greek dialects. The idea that someone might want to be alone while using the toilet, or that they might feel embarrassed about natural bodily processes, was simply not part of the cultural understanding. This lack of privacy extended to other intimate activities as well, creating a social environment that would be deeply uncomfortable for people raised with modern concepts of personal boundaries and individual dignity. Water sources were often contaminated with this waste, leading to regular outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. People learned to recognize the signs of contaminated water, but mistakes were common and often fatal. Even clean water often contained parasites and bacteria that would cause chronic digestive problems. The social structure of ancient Greek society would be particularly jarring for modern people who value equality and individual rights. If you were born a slave, and remember, slaves made up a significant portion of the population, you were considered property with no rights whatsoever. You could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at your owner's whim. Even if you were born free, your social status was rigidly determined by your birth, gender, and citizenship status. Women, regardless of their social class, had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't vote, own property, or participate in public life. They were expected to remain in their homes most of the time, venturing out only for religious festivals or essential errands. And even then, they were often required to be accompanied by male relatives. The idea of women pursuing careers, traveling independently, or making their own life choices was not just uncommon. It was literally unthinkable. If you were not born a citizen of a particular city-state, you were a foreigner with limited rights, even if you lived there for decades. Citizenship was precious and jealously guarded. In Athens, for example, both your parents had to be Athenian citizens for you to qualify for citizenship. This meant that large portions of the population were permanently excluded from political participation and many economic opportunities. The legal system was harsh and often arbitrary. Punishments for crimes that we might consider minor today could include exile, mutilation, or death. There was no concept of rehabilitation or proportional justice. If you were accused of a crime, your fate often depended more on your social status and rhetorical skills than on the actual evidence. The wealthy could hire skilled orators to defend them, while the poor had to represent themselves or face almost certain conviction. Political participation, where it existed, was nothing like modern democracy. In Athens, the famous birthplace of democracy, only adult male citizens could participate in the political process, roughly 10 to 15% of the total population. Even then, Political meetings were held during the day, meaning that anyone who had to work for a living couldn't participate. Democracy was essentially a privilege of the leisure class. Let's consider the physical demands of daily life, because this is another area where modern people would struggle dramatically. Without machines to assist with labor, everything had to be done by human muscle power. Hauling water from wells, grinding grain by hand, plowing fields with primitive tools pulled by oxen, building structures with heavy stone blocks moved by ropes and levers. All of this required a level of physical strength and endurance that most modern people simply don't possess. Women spent hours each day grinding grain into flour using heavy stone querns. This was backbreaking work that left hands raw and arms aching. The constant repetitive motion caused joint problems and chronic pain that people simply had to endure. Men working in fields or quarries developed the kind of muscular physiques that we associate with professional athletes today. But they achieved this through a lifetime of grueling labor that aged their bodies prematurely. The lack of mechanical assistance meant that simple tasks took enormous amounts of time. Spinning thread and weaving cloth was a full-time occupation for many women. It could take weeks to produce a single garment. There were no sewing machines, so everything had to be stitched by hand. Repairs to clothing, tools, and household items were constant necessities because replacement was so difficult and expensive. Transportation was slow and dangerous. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Journeys of any significant distance required walking or, if you were fortunate, riding a donkey or horse. Roads were rough paths that became muddy quagmires in rain, and dusty, rocky obstacles in dry weather. Bandits were a constant threat on remote routes, and there was no police force or organized security to protect travelers. Sea travel, while faster than walking, was extremely hazardous. Ships were small, vulnerable to weather, and frequently sank with all hands aboard. Navigation was primitive, relying on landmarks, stars, and luck. Many merchants and travelers who set out on sea voyages were never seen again, lost to storms, pirates, or simple navigational errors. The pace of life was simultaneously more relaxed and more urgent than modern life. There were no clocks, no precise scheduling, no deadlines in the modern sense. Time was measured by the sun's position, the seasons, and natural rhythms. But paradoxically, the urgency of survival made every day critical. A failed harvest, a broken tool, or an injury could mean the difference between life and death for an entire family. Weather was a constant adversary rather than a minor inconvenience. A severe storm could destroy your home, ruin your crops, or sink your fishing boat. There were no weather forecasts, no advance warning systems, no emergency services to help when disaster struck. People developed an intimate knowledge of natural signs and seasonal patterns, but they were still at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Seasonal variations had enormous impacts on daily life. Winter wasn't just colder, it was a period of genuine hardship when food stores might run low, when travel became nearly impossible, when the risk of death from cold or starvation increased dramatically. People planned their entire year around these seasonal cycles, working frantically during the growing season to store enough food and fuel to survive the winter months. The absence of artificial preservation methods meant that feast and famine cycles were regular occurrences. A good harvest meant abundance and celebration, but it was followed by months of gradually diminishing supplies and increasing anxiety about whether the food would last until the next harvest. People became experts at rationing, at stretching meager supplies, and at finding edible plants and animals when cultivated food ran out. Let's talk about entertainment and leisure, because this is another area where the contrast with modern life is stark. For the common people, entertainment was largely limited to religious festivals, which combined worship with celebration. These festivals might feature theatrical performances, athletic competitions, music, and dancing, but they occurred only a few times per year, and were often as much about religious obligation as enjoyment. Most people created their own entertainment through storytelling, singing, and simple games. Musical instruments were crude by modern standards: lyres, flutes, and drums made from animal skins and bones. There were no books for the vast majority of people who couldn't read anyway. Stories were passed down orally, and the repertoire was limited to what people could remember and repeat. Children's toys were simple objects carved from wood or shaped from clay. There were no manufactured playthings, no variety of games and activities. Children often worked alongside adults from an early age, learning the skills they would need to survive. Childhood, as a protected period of play and learning, was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. For adults, social gatherings were rare and usually tied to specific occasions like weddings, funerals, or religious observances. The concept of leisure time set aside purely for relaxation and enjoyment was foreign to most people's experience. Every moment had to be productive in some way, whether it was working, maintaining equipment, preparing food, or caring for family members. The intellectual life that we associate with ancient Greece, the philosophy, mathematics, and scientific inquiry was accessible to only a tiny fraction of the population. These were pursuits of wealthy men who had slaves to handle their practical needs. For everyone else, intellectual curiosity was a luxury they couldn't afford. Survival required all their mental and physical energy. Education was similarly limited. Most children received no formal schooling at all. They learned by watching and imitating adults, picking up the skills they needed for their predetermined roles in society. Literacy was rare and largely confined to the upper classes and certain professions like scribes and merchants. The vast majority of people lived their entire lives without ever learning to read or write. This illiteracy had profound implications for people's understanding of the world. Without access to written knowledge, they were limited to what they could learn through direct experience and oral tradition. Scientific understanding was limited and often mixed with superstition. People explained natural phenomena through mythology and religious belief, rather than empirical observation and logical reasoning. Medical knowledge, as we discussed earlier, was particularly affected by this lack of scientific method. Treatments were based on tradition, superstition, and trial and error rather than systematic study. People suffered and died from diseases and conditions that could have been prevented or treated with better understanding of anatomy, physiology, and disease. Processes that religious life of ancient Greeks was pervasive and very different from modern religious practice. Gods were seen as capricious beings who intervened directly in human affairs, rewarding and punishing people based on their whims as much as their moral behavior. Religious observance was more about appeasing these powerful beings than about moral improvement or spiritual growth. Sacrifices were central to religious practice, and these involved the actual killing of animals in elaborate rituals. The blood, smoke, and smell of these ceremonies would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. People believed that the gods literally consumed the smoke and essence of the sacrificed animals, and that failing to perform these rituals properly could bring divine punishment on entire communities. Superstition governed many aspects of daily life. People consulted oracles, interpreted omens, and made important decisions based on the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals. The boundary between religion, magic, and practical knowledge was blurry. A farmer might pray to Demeter for a good harvest, while also following traditional agricultural practices, seeing both as equally important for success. The constant presence of slavery in Greek society created a moral environment that would be deeply disturbing to modern people. Slavery wasn't just an economic institution, it was woven into the fabric of daily life for both slaves and free citizens. Free people regularly witnessed the buying, selling, and abuse of other human beings without seeing anything morally problematic about it. Slaves performed the most dangerous and unpleasant work in society. They worked in silver mines under conditions that were essentially death sentences, toiling in cramped, poorly ventilated tunnels where cave-ins and toxic gases regularly killed workers. They served as household servants who could be sexually abused with no legal recourse. They fought as gladiators for public entertainment, dying for the amusement of crowds, even for free citizens. The acceptance of slavery created a moral blind spot that extended to other areas of life. Violence was more accepted, human life was valued differently, and concepts of human rights and dignity that we take for granted simply didn't exist in any meaningful way. The treatment of women in Greek society would be particularly shocking to modern sensibilities. Women were considered intellectually inferior to men, emotionally unstable, and incapable of making important decisions. They were transferred from the authority of their fathers to their husbands like property. Their primary value was seen in their ability to produce legitimate heirs, and their lives were largely confined to domestic duties and child-rearing. Even wealthy women lived lives of restriction that would feel like imprisonment to modern women. They couldn't leave their homes without permission and escort. They couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or participate in legal proceedings. Their social interactions were limited to other women and male family members. The idea of a woman pursuing her own interests, developing her talents, or making independent choices about her life was not just discouraged. It was inconceivable. Childbirth and child-rearing were fraught with dangers and difficulties that modern people can barely imagine. Without understanding of nutrition, sanitation, or basic medical care, infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for families to lose multiple children to diseases that are easily preventable. Today, parents had to emotionally prepare themselves for the likelihood that many of their children would not survive to adulthood. Pregnancy was dangerous, with maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic today. Women gave birth with the assistance of midwives who had no formal training and limited knowledge of anatomy or safe birthing practices. Complications that could be easily handled by modern medical intervention often resulted in the death of both mother and child. The economic system of ancient Greece would be completely alien to modern people accustomed to complex financial instruments, global trade, and consumer choice. Most economic activity was local and based on direct exchange of goods and services. Money existed, but it was primarily used for large transactions. Most daily economic activity involved bartering, trading your surplus grain for someone else's, pottery, or exchanging your labor for food and shelter. There were no banks in the modern sense, number credit systems, no insurance, no mechanisms for protecting against economic risk. If your crops failed, your animals died, or your workshop burned down, you faced immediate destitution with no safety net. Families that had been prosperous could find themselves begging in the streets overnight. The concept of economic mobility, idea that you could improve your station in life through hard work and smart decisions, was largely foreign to ancient Greek society. Your economic status was primarily determined by the circumstances of your birth. If you were born into a farming family, you would almost certainly remain a farmer your entire life. If you were born a slave, you might hope for manumission, but you would never achieve the status of a freeborn citizen. Trade existed, but it was risky and limited. Merchants who engaged in long-distance trade faced enormous hazards: storms at sea, bandits on land, political conflicts that could close trade routes, and the constant possibility that their goods would be stolen or spoiled. Many trading ventures ended in complete loss, ruining the investors and creditors involved. The lack of standardized weights, measures, and currency made trade even more complicated. Every city-state had its own systems, and merchants had to constantly convert between different standards and exchange rates. Fraud was common and difficult to detect, especially for goods like grain or oil, where quality could vary significantly. Let's consider the sensory experience of ancient Greek life, because this is something that people rarely think about, but which would be immediately overwhelming to modern visitors. The smells alone would be almost unbearable. Unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting garbage, industrial processes like tanning leather and metalworking, cooking fires, and the general absence of any kind of waste management system. Cities and towns were assault on the senses in ways that modern people can barely imagine. Streets were narrow, crowded, and filled with the sounds of animals, street vendors, craftsmen, and the general chaos of people trying to conduct business and life. In cramped quarters, the noise level was probably similar to modern urban environments, but the sounds were completely different. No mechanical noises, but constant human and animal activity from dawn to dusk. The visual environment was both more and less stimulating than modern life. Colors were more muted because dyes were expensive and faded quickly. Most people wore earth-toned clothing that would look drab by modern standards. But the natural environment was more prominent in daily life. People were more aware of the sky, weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the movements of animals and plants. The absence of artificial lighting meant that people's circadian rhythms were much more closely tied to natural light cycles. This probably contributed to better sleep patterns, but it also meant that productivity was severely limited by daylight hours. Winter days were short and largely unproductive, while summer days were long and exhausting. The texture of daily life was rougher in every sense. Clothes were coarser, food was grittier, surfaces were rougher, and comfort was rare. Modern people are accustomed to smooth, soft, comfortable environments, but ancient life was full of irritation, discomfort, and physical hardship that people simply had to endure. Pain was a constant companion in ways that modern people can't appreciate. Without effective pain relief, people lived with chronic conditions that would be easily treatable today. Dental problems, joint pain, injuries that healed poorly, and various chronic illnesses created a background of discomfort that was just accepted as part of the human condition. The psychological impact of this constant physical discomfort, combined with the ever-present threat of disease, violence, and economic disaster, would be overwhelming for modern people accustomed to safety, security, and comfort. The stress of ancient life was relentless and unavoidable, creating mental health challenges that people had no effective ways to address. Yet despite all these hardships, people found ways to create meaning, beauty, and joy in their lives. They developed rich cultural traditions, told stories that still resonate today, created art and architecture that we still admire, and formed deep bonds with family and community that provided psychological support in difficult times. The ancient Greeks developed philosophical systems for understanding the good life, created political institutions that influenced democracy for millennia, and made scientific and mathematical discoveries that laid the foundation for modern knowledge. They did this not because life was easy, but perhaps because it was so difficult that they were forced to think deeply about what made existence worthwhile. But for the average person living in ancient Greece, life was primarily about survival. Rather than self-actualization, the philosophical discussions we associate with ancient Greek culture were the privilege of a tiny elite who had the leisure time to engage in such pursuits. For everyone else, life was focused on the immediate practical concerns of staying alive, feeding their families, and maintaining their place in a hierarchical social order. The lack of privacy, personal autonomy, and individual choice that characterized ancient life would be perhaps the most difficult adjustment for modern people. We're accustomed to controlling our environment, making choices about how to spend our time, and having personal space where we can be alone with our thoughts. Ancient life offered none of these luxuries. Your daily routine was dictated by survival, needs, seasonal cycles, and social obligations rather than personal preference. Your career was determined by your birth rather than your interests or aptitudes. Your marriage was likely arranged by your family for economic or political reasons, rather than romantic love. Your religious beliefs and practices were determined by your community rather than personal, spiritual searching. The concept of individual rights, the idea that you had inherent dignity and freedom, simply by virtue of being human, was absent. From ancient Greek society, your value and your treatment were determined by your social status, gender, citizenship, and family connections. Justice was about maintaining social order rather than protecting individual rights or ensuring fair treatment for all people. In conclusion, while we can admire the achievements of ancient Greek civilization and learn from their intellectual and cultural contributions, we should have no illusions about the reality of daily life in that era. For the vast majority of people, life was characterized by backbreaking labor, constant insecurity, limited opportunities, and early death. The romanticized vision of ancient Greece that we often see in popular culture bears little resemblance to the harsh realities that ordinary people faced every single day. Modern people, accustomed to comfort, security, medical care, abundant food, clean water, education, and personal freedom, would find ancient Greek life almost unbearably difficult. We've become so accustomed to controlling our environment and having our basic needs met that we've lost the physical and psychological toughness that was essential for survival in the ancient world. This isn't to say that ancient people were stronger or better than us. They were simply adapted to different circumstances. They developed different skills, different expectations, and different coping mechanisms because their survival depended on it. But for those of us living in the modern world, with all its problems and challenges, it's worth remembering just how far we've come in terms of basic human welfare, opportunity, and dignity. The next time you flip a light switch, turn on a faucet, take an aspirin for a headache, or simply enjoy the freedom to make choices about your life, remember that these simple things represent advances that would seem miraculous to our ancient ancestors. We live in a time of unprecedented comfort, opportunity, and freedom. Even with all the problems that remain to be solved, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, theater, and countless other contributions to human civilization. But it also reminds us that progress is real, that human life has genuinely improved in fundamental ways, and that we should be grateful for the advantages we often take for granted. Most of us wouldn't survive a week in ancient Greece, and that's actually a testament to how much better life has become for ordinary people over the centuries.